Hi, I'm Radia Glees. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist here in Austin at Austin Integrative Medicine. The other day I was talking about weight loss, and I was talking about clinically supervised weight loss, and I promised you that I would talk again about what's the deal with fats. And I had mentioned that it takes fat to burn fat. And this is a big confusion because for years and years, for the last really 2 decades, everybody's been saying fat is the problem. Take fat out of the diet and you'll lose weight. Now, how's that working for you? When you look at statistically the rate of obesity, the rate of diabetes, etc., since the 80s has actually increased dramatically. So we started, this campaign of taking fat out of the diet, and things became fat-free, fat, non-fat, low-fat, and basically we as a society started to become fat-phobic. Now, I know you've heard this before, but even when I teach my classes, and sometimes I will, at the end of the class, I'll give them a diary, and they'll write out, the foods that they've been eating, and they'll deliberately say fat-free ice cream, or I ate, diet soda, or I did, fat-free or low-fat or non-fat, this and that. It is important to make sure that you get the right kinds of fat, but it is really important to understand that not all fat is alike. Now, you may have heard by now that there's good fats and there's bad fats, and you've got your omega-6s and omega-3s, that's your fish oils and flaxseed oil and things like that. And then there's the bad oils, which are hydrogenated fat. Now, understand this, it's really important to realize that not all fat is alike, and when you look at it, the configuration, the molecular configuration of fat is really kind of simple. Well, no, it's not simple. It's kind of complex, but I'm going to make it simple. Saturated fat, these fat molecules are held together by hydrogen bonds. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but they're held together by hydrogen bonds. So saturated literally means that the molecule is saturated with hydrogen bonds. Okay? So polyunsaturated or monounsaturated it's not completely saturated or held together or bound with hydrogen. So mono means one. So it means that one of these links in this molecule is separate. Okay, so you're going to find olive oil as a typical example of a monounsaturated fat. The poly, which means many of these bonds are not held together with hydrogen. So you've got these molecules that are much more flexible. Now, why is this important? Well, understand that hydrogen literally holds that molecule solid. Okay, so it's a really easy way to remember. Most things that stay solid at room temperature are saturated fats. Okay, solid at room temperature. So what would that be? Well, butter, for example. Butter in a stick stays solid at room temperature. Coconut oil is pretty high in saturated fat. What else? Lard. Yeah. That'll stay high, and that'll stay solid. So that's, you can always tell really what's saturated. Now, be careful when you see these margarines and other things. If they're staying solid, that's a whole other story. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're high in saturated fat, but they're high in a different kind of fat I'm going to talk about in a minute. Then the monounsaturated fat molecule is flexible. Okay, now this is why it's a good fat. This is why it's good, because think about your body, your veins and arteries, okay? They twist and turn, and you literally have thousands and thousands. I think you have, they say, more, if you took your vascular system and you stretched it out, you could stretch it from here to the sun and back. I mean, this vascular system is amazing when you pull it all together. So it twists and turns and has loops and what have you. So the more flexible the fat is, obviously, the more flexible it is in your arteries. Okay, so saturated fat, can be a problem, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not all saturated fat is bad. And they did do studies where they noticed that the Polynesians, for example, they ate a lot of coconut. And coconut is high in saturated fat, but it's not necessarily what we call atherosclerotic. It doesn't necessarily clog and get stuck in the arteries like other fats do. Actually, they did the studies on fat, and they found that the biggest problems with all of those studies was that the fats that they were using were not just saturated fats, but they were used with partially hydrogenated fat. Now, when you hear the term partially hydrogenated fat, forget it. It's either hydrogenated or it isn't. So how do we get to that? What is hydrogenated fat, and why is it bad? Well, remember our configuration of our fat molecule. The good thing about the more saturated it is the more stable it is. So, you know, fat, we know when it's exposed to oxygen, light, and temperature, it can break down, and that molecule breaks. And it goes into what we call a rancid fat. And that can be a toxic to the system. It can create free radicals, which I'll talk about at another time. But it can create free radicals, and it can become toxic to the system. So a hydrogenated fat, it was really good because in storage and in shipping and in processing food, the big food manufacturers, well, they needed a solution because they couldn't get it to market without it going rancid. So they thought, well, this is a good idea, and saturated fat, it's a little bit more stable, but back in actually World War II, you couldn't get butter, you couldn't get a lot of fats. They were very hard to come by. So they decided to take some of these oils, and in a laboratory, they decided to sort of make their own kind of Frankenstein molecule, and they called it partially hydrogenated. Now remember, early on, I said it's hydrogen atoms that bond or hold these fats together. So partially hydrogenated, now there's nothing partial about it. You either hydrogenate it or you don't. So the partially hydrogenated part is they decided that they would take a regular mono or polyunsaturated fat and add the hydrogen back into it to keep it solid. So there's some of your margarines that are, they say 100% polyunsaturated, but if they're held together and solid at room temperature, they've got some sort of stable molecule in there. So check the labels because many of them are with hydrogenated fat. The problem with hydrogenated fat is that the molecule is not only is it solid and doesn't move, but it's sort of kinked. Right? So the molecular configuration is sort of like this Lego toy that is traveling through your venous and your arterial system. So what happens is, in the studies that I mentioned before, is very many of the studies that were talking about fat being a cause of cardiovascular disease, etc., was really studies showing this hydrogenated fat. Now, I will tell you that in Europe, in Canada, and in many parts of this world, they do not even legalize hydrogenated fat. So only in the United States, where the FDA has basically allowed hydrogenated fats to be in food products, will you find that. But it's where it's illegal in other places, it gives us food for thought to think about. So it's really important to keep hydrogenated fats out of the diet, keep a moderate amount of saturated fat. The good kinds of saturated fat, such as coconut oil, which has a high temperature, but it seems to be a stable molecule, and it's good to cook with, but it's a non-atherosclerotic. In other words, it doesn't seem to clog in the arteries as other fats do. And a rich supply of the loose, the polyunsaturated. These are your lipids like cod liver oil and your marine lipids. And one of the reasons why these are so good is they're so flexible that they actually go in and sweep the arteries and pull out all the bad plaque and the bad saturated fat and other stuff that's getting stuck in there. So this is why these are the good guys, and we want to make sure that we have a lot more of the omega-6s and omega-3s and be careful of the saturated fats. So we want the polyunsaturated and the monounsaturated fats. And this is typical of diets such as the Mediterranean diet, which is higher in these oils, fats and oils, mostly olive oil. And you really see a lot more healthy people in the Mediterranean diet. So check with me. There's more on fats, and you can visit my website, www.advancedhealthinstitute.com. Please send your comments, and make sure, if you haven't registered, make sure you push that yellow button and register. We love to hear from you. I love to hear your comments and questions. Again, you can go to my website, advancedhealthinstitute.com, ask me any questions or see what I do or some of my services. Also, I have a YouTube program, which is youtube.com/AHI Productions, which is more on complementary and alternative medicine. So visit me there, and we'll talk more about fats and other things in our next episode.